I'm Deontay Jenkins, and here's what's on my mind. I, like many movie lovers, have missed the movie-going experience since most theaters have shut down in 2020. In a year where most people are watching more movies than ever, it's kind of ironic that the movie industry finds itself in one of its most uncertain spots in decades. With most studios wanting their box office receipts to surpass the price tag that it costs to make the films, many are opting to put it on streaming platforms or push the release date back entirely. But with so many going on streaming platforms, I've noticed something is missing. But before we get into that, make sure you hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Give this video a thumbs up if you think it's cool. You can check out my latest short film by clicking here or in the description below. And here we go. To be completely honest, a lot of things are missing. Namely, the experience of going to a theater with a room full of strangers and watching the same thing at the same time and experiencing and feeling that same thing with a bunch of people that you've never met before. It's that communal experience that we long for. Although with social media, a new type of communal experience has developed around films that become almost viral. But that's not what I'm talking about. With 4K TV screens getting bigger, the viewing experience at home is becoming a lot better over the years. Still not on the level of a 2-story cinema screen, but much better than the 2-foot boxes that we had 20 years ago. But the thing that I'm actually finding myself missing is the sound. Most people, or at least most people that I know, don't have big surround sound systems to match their giant 4K televisions, which honestly even further strips away the immersiveness of cinema. It's weird talking about the sound of an art form that's so inherently visual, but as time has gone on, I've noticed that films are getting louder and louder with layers of sound being added to each moment to the point of sensory overload. But there are those films that use silence more powerfully than sound. And to understand that, I want to take us back to another time where the future of cinema seemed uncertain, and to a filmmaker who used silence more loudly than an explosion. The time I'm talking about is in the late 20s with the advent of sound, a time where every studio wanted to match the success of the jazz singer, the very first sound film.
Wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet. Wait a minute, I tell you, you ain't heard nothing.
And filmmakers were worried about the future of their precious medium that up until this point had been strictly based on visuals. Many were reluctant to make the transition to sound, seeing it as a fad or as an unpure dilution of their precious art form. But those who wouldn't or couldn't make that transition to sound were eventually left behind. Now, Fritz Lang, like many successful silent era directors, was also reluctant to make the transition to sound. He was as successful as it gets when it comes to silent films, making landmark films such as Metropolis, which would be equivalent to today's modern sci-fi blockbuster. But in realizing that the medium was moving on without him, along with many other factors, Fritz Lang decided to direct his first talkie, M. Considered by many film scholars to be a masterpiece of the early sound era, M is a disturbing story about a child murderer, played by Peter Lorre in his first starring role, who was hunted down and brought to justice by Berlin's criminal underworld. The film is credited for starting both the serial killer genre as well as the police procedural. When speaking about the film, most critics and film scholars will bring up the striking images, and rightfully so. Faces in the film are highlighted in a way that disturbs and intrigues. In fact, most of the imagery in the film is deeply striking and has an extra layer of depth to it. Although the images are well composed in their own right, the thing that makes the images stand out the most for me is the silence underneath them. Take for instance the murder in the opening scene. The murder doesn't take place on camera. Instead, what we get is a mother shouting out for her daughter and then silence. This silence is combined with 3 images: an empty dinner plate and a chair, a ball that we saw young Elsie have earlier rolling away from what we can only assume is her murder spot, and the balloon given to her by the murderer stuck on a power line. These images are haunting, but not because what they show. Quite the opposite, in fact. We were given information at the beginning of the film. There's a murderer on the loose killing kids. And when Elsie is met by this mysterious man and doesn't turn up at home, we know her fate. But it's the brilliance and the silence of the scene that allows the audience to put together all the pieces of information that we have up until this point, which makes the audience's imagination work and makes us picture what happened to Elsie rather than being shown or told what happened to Elsie. The audience needs that moment of silence to process and let their imaginations do the work for them. This moment is meditative for the audience, and it wouldn't have been achieved without the silence that went on top of it. There's no music or dialogue to manipulate the audience, simply the sound of silence.
Elsie! Elsie! Elsie!
And this type of silence continues throughout the film. There's not actually that much dialogue in the film. Fritz Lang was wise to use his dialogue sparingly. Many early talkies felt the need to talk all the time.
Bet you couldn't have sold a whole prince's leg like he did.
Yeah, well, who wants to be a horse doctor?
Hey, George, the baby's sure cute today, ain't he, huh?
You bet, just like his dad.
You can't do this to me.
I'm trying to, Dad.
But Lang allows his camera to prowl through the streets and the dives, allowing us to develop our own feelings based on what we see rather than what we hear. The mastery of visuals likely comes from the fact that visuals at the time is all that he knew. But because there was also sound accompanying the film, the silence became even more powerful. Many times throughout the film, Fritz Lang chooses to use actual silence, not ambient sound, but complete and utter silence. One of the most powerful shots in this film is utterly silent, as the captured killer is dragged into the basement to be confronted by the city's assembled criminals, and the camera shows their hard and cold faces. Living in today's cinematic landscapes, I'm used to sound being used to draw attention to something, but Fritz actually does the opposite. He often demands the attention of the audience in his most silent moments. But beyond the lack of sound, it's where he chose not to use sound that really is impressive. Every use of silence is powerful and poignant, and I can't help but think that films like No Country for Old Men and even A Quiet Place to an extent have borrowed and used some of Fritz Lang's techniques from M. In a time where sound seemed to be taken over and silence seemed to be fading into the background noise, Fritz took silence and put it at the forefront of his film. But M didn't simply regress back into the silent era. It took the newfound sound and the silent era and made a perfect marriage between the two. In my eyes, M is the bridge between the silent era and the sound era. Yes, there were many talkies that came before, and yes, there were many silent films that came after, but none married the two quite like M. A blend of pure visual cinema with the new voice that it found. If an artist like Fritz Lang didn't exist, we wouldn't have the aforementioned No Country for Old Men. His silence didn't just make silence, it made every sound count. It took a genius of the silent era to take the silence of cinema into the newfound sound era and turn the volume up on that sound so loud that every word, every sound, every bit of music counted more than it would have before. That is cinema. But then again, what do I know? Thank you for watching, guys. Make sure you hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Give this video a like if you think it's any good. Check out my latest short film here or by clicking the link in the description below. You can follow me here on social media and make sure you come back next time because I think you're pretty cool. Peace.